I will go briefly, and Larry covered a little bit of this earlier, about how this came to pass, this analysis. We have done a number of papers related to broadband adoption, particularly in the OECD, given the availability of data. And I was invited to Portugal to present the research. Portugal turned out to fare pretty well in my analysis, so I guess they wanted me to come over and speak the truth to them, at least the truth they preferred. And we met and discussed some things afterwards, and one of their concerns was that the OECD did not count mobile broadband connections in their rankings data. This was important to Portugal because they had just spent a huge sum of money, certainly to Portugal, to deploy or to increase adoption of broadband by students and teachers, elementary school students and teachers. They subsidized laptops, and they had air cards that came with the laptops, and the rates there were also reduced significantly. That choice, of course, was not going to show up in the OECD broadband rankings. That choice to Anacom and the Portuguese was the best choice, they thought, for them. That's how they were going to deploy the service. It was the cheapest, most effective way to get broadband in the hands of the people they thought it was most important to get broadband in the hands of, which were the kids, because that's the future of the country. It's much more difficult to get older people to adopt things than it is children. The children need it in the schools. As I looked at their policies more and more, I think if people here looked at their policies more and more, you'd be a little bit envious. Now, I will give them credit. They have 2 PhD economists on their FCC commission, and it shows, I think, and much of their analysis, it certainly shows in the questions they ask when you present your research. I don't recall ever being asked questions like that about model specification and endogeneity and heteroscedasticity and things like that from a chairman of a regulatory agency, but that was interesting. So I found the whole thing very, very interesting, because these guys were making policy the right way and probably being punished for it. Because in the end, there were some people who would have bought fixed connections that got mobile connections through the program, and that therefore reduced their number of fixed connections, and you can actually see the numbers go down a little bit, and hurt them in the rankings. In the end, I don't know if it made enough to move them one spot or not, but it was clearly not working well for them. So they asked me to come up with a plan to get the fixed and mobile piece together. Now, I added the economically meaningful and policy relevant piece in there. But what the goal was is to create an economically meaningful and policy relevant index of broadband adoption that is capable of handling heterogeneous connection modalities. That is, you have fixed and mobile, and you can put them together to create an index. This sounds like an easy problem, but it's a very, very difficult problem, it turns out, for a number of reasons, which I'll cover. But that was the goal of the analysis. For those of you who might want to fall asleep or who think I'm crazy, at some point, I will give you a bit of encouragement here. If we do spend the $7 billion and have ubiquitous deployment of broadband, it is unlikely that our OECD rank will change. I don't know if people have thought that through. I do know some people have thought that through. That tells you one thing, or it tells you two things, or gives you an option of two things. One is that the stimulus is a bad idea. The other is our metrics are not any good. I think it's the latter, okay? Without saying whether I like the stimulus or not, I think the metrics are bad. And I think that case proves it. And if you live by the metrics, you die by the metrics. And I'm afraid that in the end, some people will pay the price for using the metrics when the thing doesn't change our ranking, and we spend $7 billion, and it looks like a total waste of money to some people. Of course, they'll change their mind about the rankings when that day comes, I suspect. Oops, what was that? All right, so what is the Broadband Adoption Index? And this is going to be a highly conceptual analysis today, and I hate to do that to you, but it is a highly conceptual point. In its most general form, okay, any adoption index, I believe, in its most general form, takes this form. And it says, what is your actual level of deployment, of adoption, of whatever, over your target level of adoption? Okay? We do not measure things like this today. Okay? We take something like the actual and we divide it by population or households or something else, which is really completely uninformative. Okay? Population is not a target for adoption or for deployment. Okay? In the U.S., in this country, we had ubiquitous availability of telephone service. We had near universal adoption, 95% probably on average, 93%, 95% on average. There was no shortage of it. Our telephone to population per capita rate was 0.493. Okay? So if we have ubiquitous deployment of broadband, near universal adoption of broadband, our ratio will be about 0.5. Okay, maybe even less, because people buy multiple phones and they don't buy multiple broadband connections for the most part. Okay, businesses and residential connections. So it would probably be actually less than that. Okay, so it's not like a penetration rate, which people use the language a lot. It's not a penetration because it doesn't move to 1. It's not bound on the unit interval, and it's not bound on the same interval for every country. In Sweden, we had the same situation, near ubiquitous availability, near universal adoption. Their subscription rate was 0.686. Okay? So even though there's no difference between the U.S. and Sweden on this point, there is a difference in the ranking. And the problem is, or in the subscription rate, and this in the rankings, the problem is that the consumption of it differs by household size and by business portfolio. What types of businesses, what do they buy, those sorts of things. So there are differences, and the per capita approach just doesn't work. As Larry was talking about earlier, we have the broadband nirvana, which is another way to criticize this issue, a paper we wrote in 2007, 2 years ago. I hear this is being used frequently as of late. If we had universal adoption in every country in the OECD, we'd rank 20th. Okay? So even still, and we still see huge differences from Sweden at 0.54 to Turkey at 0.212, even though there's universal adoption. Okay? Obviously, this index of adoption is not scaled appropriately. All these numbers should be equal. Okay? If they're not equal, it's a bad metric, by definition. Another way to look at this is to think about this line here is population. The vertical line is the share of the potential market. So this is from 0 to 1 saturation, true penetration rate on the vertical, and per population on the horizontal. The blue line measures what the OECD is measuring. The orange line there is an economy A, which has a household size of 3 homes, 3 persons per home, and like Portugal, approximately. And you can see that its maximum at 100% subscription of households, this doesn't include businesses, is 0.33. Okay, so it never gets close to 1. Ooh, hello. The alternative here is economy B, which is like Sweden, a household size of 2. And you can see it moves along a completely different line. Okay, if we assume, and this maximum penetration is 0.5. So we have this range, potential for this range of deception in the statistic, where economy A has complete saturation Economy B does not, but as long as its saturation is saturation about 0.6, it will appear to be preferenced over the economy A. Okay? So you have this scaling problem related to the household size. And this is true. This range of deception exists across the whole spectrum. Okay? It's always in error. Now, you could get a case where the ranking was correct, but there's also a very high probability that it's incorrect. We've seen the trends, and I'll go through this a little more quickly because I don't have time. The ranking issue for the United States, what you see here is the standard rank. All the countries that ranked high are now ranking low. Okay, they're all moved down. The U.S. moved from 4th to 15th, and that's a big deal. Everybody wants to be 4th again. The next case here is the countries that moved up, and you see some of the countries that lower are starting to move up. What's interesting about this data, and if you study this data enough, you'll see this when it hit me immediately when I made this table. Here is the telephone subscription rates, top 10 telephone per capita. Here's the top 10 broadband per capita. Okay, and what you see is that in every case but one, they're the same people. Okay, it's the same people. So what does this mean if you track it out? For the top 10, you get a 90% match between telephone subscriptions per capita and broadband subscriptions per capita. Okay? For the middle, you get an 80% match, and for the bottom, you get an 80% match. The ranking thing, on the per capita ranking, is just moving to this outcome of telephones per capita. Okay? I've done a paper last year called The Convergence of Ranks, where you actually see, this is a figure from that, where you actually see that the differences in ranks over time for countries is shrinking. And we're converging to telephone ranks. In fact, the convergence has stopped. There are some differences. But for most everybody, whether you were below your telephone rank or above it or below it, over time you have migrated to it. Okay? Which tells you that there's not a whole lot you can do about that number. Okay? It's sort of embedded in your blood to some extent. There are a certain number of homes, there's a certain number of businesses, they consume certain kinds of things, and this is true for broadband like it is for telephone, and the things are just going to be the same. The U.S. is destined to be around 15th in broadband subscriptions, not because of a failure, just like there's no failure in telephone, it's just the way the numbers work out between household sizes and businesses and things of that nature. Other issues with the OECD is, and the reason we were requested to write this paper was because it includes only fixed connections. Now that's about to change. The OECD, at the request of a number of countries, and I would say reluctantly, have agreed to begin to include mobile broadband in their connections. But this presents a difficult problem. How do they include it? Well, there are some rules by which they count. One is a 256 kilobit minimum rule. The other is you either have to use it or buy it to count, which I think are sensible rules. That's not the problem. The problem is how do you then have, when you have two different numbers, one's mobile and one's fixed, how do you add those things together? Okay, that becomes a very difficult problem. Now, God damn it. Larry, can you set up your question? Okay, so, Christ. I just think, wow, that's doing that. Okay, so what'll end up happening, unless they abandon the population per capita calculation altogether, is that we'll have an index for fixed, okay, which is, or actually it's going to be more like wireline, an index for wireline, that's going to be wireline divided by population, I suspect, or 100 people, like they do today. And then we'll have a second category that's wireless, that will be also divided by population. Whether or not they sum the two together, I don't know. In the end, I'm sure people will want to do that. Is that appropriate? Well, it's really not appropriate. And this is the problem that we have, is how do we combine something like a fixed connection, which is shared among multiple users, and a mobile connection which is typically, not always, but typically consumed by an individual. You also have the case where people consuming the mobile connection are also consuming fixed connections. Okay? So you could end up in a situation where you have a whole lot of connections, but you still have half the people that don't have access at all because one half of the population is consuming both. Okay? So you have this counting problem in the scale of the issue in terms of whether it's a shared connection or a personal connection. We also have issues related to the SIM card issue in wireless, which in Europe, when you cross a border, a country border, you get a different SIM card, or many people at least do. You don't really roam in different countries, so everybody has 4 or 5 SIM cards in their wallet or in their phone or wherever it is. And some people in other countries do the same, but mostly people that travel in Europe a lot will do that. So their wireless counts look enormous relative to ours in terms of the telephone, wireless telephone. Are we going to have that problem with broadband? I don't know, but it could look like their numbers are very, very large relative to ours. And I've covered those points. Let's keep this thing from falling. Okay, so what do we do? Well, let's just say we add fixed and mobile. Well, that doesn't really make sense because of the sharing rule. One option that I considered early on was, and other people had suggested, was why not just scale one or the other? For example, we could take the mobile connection and divide by household size, okay, or whatever the share rate would be. Okay, and you could come up with something else. Okay, we believe that 3 people on average share a fixed connection, so we're going to cut the mobile connection in 3. But this makes some pretty kooky assumptions. Okay, one is that mobile is basically a sorry form of fixed. Okay, in some constant proportion. It's just a bad fixed line. Okay, and it ignores the fact that 1 is something you can carry around with you and 1 is not. Okay, 1 has the potential to download high-definition video you can watch on your TV, and 1 does not. I mean, they're very, very different things. Okay, so in a world where you have 2 modalities that are very different, and you could think of dial-up being a modality or many other things, a satellite being a different modality. How do you make those 2 things the same? How do you add them together when they're so very different? Okay? And there's really, in my opinion, only one way to really think about that, or at least this is where the analysis led you, and that is simply to place a value on the quantities. Okay? If you think about the problem yourself, without have listened to this, you'll eventually come to the realization, I think, is you'd say, well, what is the value of the social value of a connection, of a fixed connection, and what is the social value of a mobile connection? Okay? And if we convert everything to values, to dollars in essence, then we can add things together. Okay? And there's no problem. It's consistent. Okay. And so what this is it says, let's take the average value of, this is a 1 modality case. Okay, we'll get to the 2 modality case in a minute. The actual is the quantity actually consumed at some point in time, December 2008 or whatever, connections, fixed connections in this case. What is the average value of that fixed connection? And then in the target, in the bottom is, what is the target adoption quantity and the value of the target adoption quantity. Okay? So in both cases, we're looking at value. Okay? Now you could take out, and I'll talk about in a minute, we can take these values out under certain circumstances, but in the dual modality case or the multiple modality case, it's very difficult to eliminate the values and get a sensible number. What am I talking about here? Well, let's define value. Value consists of 3 pieces in our analysis. One is the willingness to pay to the consumer, the demand curve. The other is some sort of social premium that people like to talk about, but never really like to define clearly or measure. Okay? But let's just assume that it does exist and is positive in most cases. And the third is some cost of production. Broadband is not a free good. Okay? It costs money. And in some cases, a lot of money. Okay? And you have to recognize that it is not free, because that changes the analysis significantly. What are we doing here? Well, here's the standard old supply and demand setup that most of you hate, but may remember from your undergraduate. We have a downward sloping demand curve, which is just the willingness to pay of the consumer. And we just had a study I saw yesterday from Compass consulting firm that says the average willingness to pay for broadband in this country is about $27, $28 on average. Of course, people value it differently. We have the cost. This is what it costs to provide, and I'm ignoring the fixed and marginal cost distinction here. Let's just keep it simple. And then we have this social premium or externality or whatever you want to call it. Now, in the linear framework, I can either add that to the demand curve or subtract it from the cost curve. It makes no difference. So what I've done is subtract it from the cost curve. Okay? And what you see is the standard result. If we ignore the premium, social premium, we get Q prime as the output level, as the optimal output level. If we include it, then we get Q star, the social welfare maximizing premium, which is higher than Q prime. We also have over here Q, where the willingness to pay is 0, okay, which is not optimal. Okay. Maximal subscription, 100% subscription is not optimal. 100% availability is tough to call optimal, okay, because it does cost something. And if something has a positive cost, unless E is enormous, so big that whatever the cost is, it's okay to have. If somebody were to say, for example, it costs $200,000 to run a connection to that house way over there in rural Arizona, would you think that would be a wise expenditure of government funds? To have one connection at $200,000. Do anybody think that's a good idea? Nobody thinks that's a good idea. Okay, but we're just quibbling over price. Okay, $10,000, $15,000. I mean, what is it? What's the level where you'd say, no, we're not going to do that? That's pretty important when you think about broadband adoption. Social value is just the area, or net social value, is just this area under the demand curve and above the cost line. Okay, and this is what we're going to use to measure. Now, what you see is if we took subscription from Q star, you could think of this also as deployment, either way, is Q star, and we went to Q where the willingness to pay is 0, it should be V equals 0. You can see we actually have a negative welfare. We have welfare loss there, and you can see here where welfare rises, peaks at Q star, and then falls off. So you can actually have a case where there's excess consumption of broadband. Okay, that's a concept that's fairly off the map at this point, but it is quite possible that you consume too much. Okay, if you were to take that circuit to the $200,000 house, the $200,000 circuit to that house, that would reduce the social welfare broadband to this country. Okay, and that's a pretty important point to remember. We also have differences in Q stars depending on whether the market is a low-cost market or a high-cost market. In this market, it's low-cost. You get a big Q star. If cost is high, you get a little Q star. Okay? So the optimal deployment or adoption, or optimal deployment, I guess in this case, or adoption in this case, is lower if the costs are high. Okay? Even if you include the social premium, unless the social premium is just infinite, and then nothing matters. Then you just do whatever you want to. You also have the case where if you have different demand curves, you have a high demand market here and a low demand market here, you can see that the quantity is lower in the low demand market than in the high demand market. Okay. The demand for broadband for older persons in every country is low. Okay. The expectation should be that adoption in that segment will be low. Okay. When you set the target for the elderly segment in the United States, which probably deserves its own target, then that level of consumption should be lower than, say, teenagers or students, or whatever it may be. What does the Broadband Adoption Index look like? Well, it is the V star part is the total value divided by the quantity, and then the social value is V. That's the denominator of the index. Okay, what is the total value that broadband should provide us at some optimal? That's the target. Okay, And that is probably the most important piece of the analysis, is the target. Because if there's one thing we don't have, we have adoption in this country, we have deployment in this country, but we have no idea what it is that we really want, other than more of it. Okay? And we want to be ranked higher, but unfortunately that's just not going to happen. Maybe a little, but certainly not in the top 5. So we can see here how the BAI would be computed. If you had, and this assumes here that the early adopters are the most valued adopters. You see here we have a Q1, which is in period 1, we have adoption of Q1. We have the optimals here. So we have A plus B is the value divided by Q1 is this average value. So the total value is V1 times Q1, and then V star times Q star, which is the entire area ABC, is the index. So we have A plus B plus C. That's the technical aspect of the calculation put in graphical format. Okay, in the multimodality case, it looks very much the same. We just have 2 pieces. We have the fixed piece and a mobile piece. Okay, and we ask the question: what is the optimal deployment of mobile? What's the optimal deployment of fixed? And these things are going to be related. What is the consumption of fixed and the consumption of mobile? In a valuation sense. Okay, what is the value of these things? That is pretty much the easiest form I could come up with that allowed you to add the disparate things. Now this is ugly, I admit. It's not something I think that you're going to go run off and do today, sitting at your desk looking up something on the OECD's website. This requires a significant amount of work. It does simplify a little bit, and this form here is useful. What this says is that we can condense this almost to a quantity index, at least for a single modality, which would just be whatever we observe the quantity to be divided by some optimal quantity. It's a little different than what we do today, because the first thing we have to do is define what the optimal quantity is. Okay? What do we want to happen? What is the adoption rate that we want? Okay? And I know people will say 100%, but let's get real. What is the adoption rate that we want? Do we think that the target is 80% adoption of broadband in 5 years? Okay? Is that your target? Well, set that as a target and then measure your success. Now, this lambda term reflects the diminishing marginal value of connections. Okay? And what this says is that if you have half the people on it, you've probably got more than half the value from broadband. Okay? As you move forward in time, you're getting people who value it less, both in a willingness to pay, who are probably going to use it less, which means the premium is probably lower, and they probably cost more to provide. Okay? The guys that aren't served today implies that the profit from serving them is negative. Okay? So it must be that their value is lower. Okay? So over time, the value of additional broadband connections declines. So if 50% of the people have subscribed, you're probably at 70%, 80% of the value. Okay? You can also think of this in terms, and I like to think of this in terms of the stimulus. We've got $7 billion to push broadband further. Okay? That $7 billion counts against whatever value we derive from the new connections. Okay? It's a subtraction. That's the cost to get those connections. Okay? So they have to, by definition, be of lower value. If we have to educate people, if we have to spend money to educate people to say you want broadband, or convince them or browbeat them or whatever is intended to do, that costs money. And that has to be subtracted from whatever value it is. Okay? So we're really at the margins today of the valuation of broadband. We've pretty much already gotten much of the value, the social value from broadband. Now that's not to say we should give up. Okay? But it shows you there's a distinction between counts and value. Okay? The count is not the value. Most of the value is already obtained. I did a little simulation of this. You basically just need a couple of demand curves. And then you move about over time under some cost conditions. And what you see here is that we have an optimal adoption rates here of 0.7 for the modality F and 0.6 for modality M. What this tells you is that in optimality, if things have positive costs and different demands, that it's going to be a mix of both. Okay? And the OECD's focus on fixed only sends improper signals, because people are going to say, oh, I want to do the fixed because that gets counted, not the mobile. Because that, or maybe they'll do something else. They'll encourage the fixed over the mobile, which is a bad social policy. But we can see that there will be a mix of the two. Only in the case of zero cost for everything would there be 100%. Would there be 100% adoption of both? Only if both have zero cost. Broadband is not free. We also provide some simulations and alternatives and show that as the value or cost of one changes, you can quickly get a move to a different modality. I imagine in places like Africa, mobile broadband is going to be pretty much the only form of broadband. How does that get incorporated into a metric? Okay? If you're just summing fixed and mobile, this is going to be a problem. Okay? But if you think about it in terms of the value, what they value is we want mobile adoption, no fixed, all mobile, and then their index would be comparable to somebody else, because it's simply being asked how much have you achieved of your target. Our target would be 80% of the population having a mobile broadband connection, 0 having fixed. If I don't have any fixed, then it's not a problem. Whereas in the OECD style, that would be viewed as a problem. You'd rank terribly on the fixed connections, or probably terribly in some combination of the two, depending how they're added. Can it be done? Well, what you need to do is get some data on what is purchased, how much is paid, a little bit of demographics, and some cost data, and you can actually implement this thing. We provide an example in the paper, show you how the econometrics would work, and estimate a BAI for a hypothetical country. Many countries already collect this data. Portugal has tried to collect the data. They were short a few important pieces of information, but I think in the end most countries will begin to collect this, and it may be possible in fact to extrapolate information from one country to the other. But all you're saying is, here's the demand curves, we're estimating demand curves, and then we say here's what it cost. And we do this in this country too. When we look at the rural areas of the United States, we're not thinking fiber to the home, we're thinking mobile broadband connections. Or some kind of wireless or WiMAX solution. Whatever is the most economically efficient solution is the solution that we're interested in. Target setting. I think this is pretty important. Here's some targets from Portugal. At least 50% of household broadband adoption. Okay? Now, do you think that the United States would be happy with that? At least half the homes having broadband. I think we're already above that. So we wouldn't be happy with that. But this is their target. Okay? Portugal is not the United States. Okay? So when we compare success for their target is 50% adoption, where we're already past that. Okay? But we're not looking at 50% adoption as a target. We're probably more, some people would say 100%. I'd think probably 80% would be a more reasonable figure. Some people don't have computers. Unless if you include mobile, then you've got a cell phone that's like a computer. They also said we want to have public internet locations. Okay? In the OECD methodology, that would be terrible for you. Okay? If you had a connection that was shared by 1,000 people, that would be horrible. Okay? But yet, there's enormous value in that. People don't have to maintain their own computers. Okay? But they can still get access. It's like library access and things like that. That may, in certain circumstances, be the best solution that you can come up with. Okay? And it provides enormous value, but in an accounting context, it looks terrible. Okay? That's a separation of value in counting. Increase the number of computers in schools. Okay? These are the goals that they've set for themselves. 100% of the government having broadband and 100% of hospitals with broadband. I haven't seen anything at the federal level like this for our country. Some of the states are doing this through their mapping programs and things like that. The Connected Nation programs, they'll say we want 100% hospital connectivity. In the state of Alabama, it was 100% library connectivity with webcams so the kids could talk to their parents in Iraq and things like that. So there are reasons. But we have to think about in target setting, and this is also completely ignored, in the current methodology. And I don't think this is just an issue between countries. This is also an issue in the United States, between parts of states, between rural and urban areas like that. It is unreasonable to expect everybody to be the same. It's unreasonable to expect a poor area to adopt as much broadband as a rich area. Okay? Because, A, they have to have a computer. Computers are expensive. They have to pay for service. Okay? They have to know how to operate a computer. I mean, they could be illiterate, whatever. I mean, you have constraints on adoption. So you cannot simply say that compare Mexico and the United States and the same. 60% of houses in Mexico have indoor plumbing. Okay? I mean, you cannot say that they're going to have the same broadband adoption in that, or that would be efficient. Comparing countries on per capita terms says nothing about the success or failure of broadband policy. In Portugal, they said, we're going to do 50%. Okay? If they achieve that, then good for them. That's what they established. In Turkey and Mexico, it may be less than that. Okay? But if they work at it and they get a result of 30% adoption, is that a failure or is that a success? I would view it as a success. Now, is it 80% like in the United States? No, but they're not the United States. I've done a lot of this analysis. I get better at it. My R-squared keeps getting bigger in sensibly specified models. But what we have here is the 30 OECD countries. 93% of the differences in the countries' adoption rates are related to these factors: prices, income inequality, age, urban, and the number of telephones they have. Okay? I can explain all of the differences across these countries pretty much, with the exception of Greece, which is kind of an outlier in the statistics. Okay? They have a very low broadband subscription rate. So in the implementation of a BAI, you would take that into consideration. We would adjust poor countries down. We would expect less. Okay? And in a BIA approach, whether it's the specific way I've described it here, which is not very specific but general, whether or not you do it that way or not, okay, the goal is to say what's the actual over what's the target, and we have to establish the target adoption rate. And the target adoption rate for poor countries, uneducated countries, for countries with high income inequality, for countries that have more rural populations, then we have to adjust the expectations down in the index. Okay? And that can be done even with the OECD methodologies, as we've done in our two papers, the BPI paper and the BEI paper. So what's the summary of this? It's kind of hard to say to some extent because it's a bit complicated, and I know I haven't done the best job today of presenting it. I can't see my screen. I can't walk around. The per capita normalizations are misguided. Okay? I would say that's one takeaway, and I think I've beaten that. That horse won't die. I have beaten it, but it will not die, and I don't think it will ever die until we get around to spending a few $1 billion and we're still 15th. And then everybody will start going, hey, what was that Ford guy saying about the adoption index? I kind of like his ideas better. But what we need to do, and we need to include all modalities, and I think that argument is a bit over. I think the OECD has decided to count that, and how they do it is a different question. Combining these things is very tricky. I think if there is a takeaway from the analysis, it's this. If we're going to have meaningful measures of adoption, okay, then we have to set targets. We have to set meaningful targets. Okay? If the goal of the $7 billion stimulus is 100% availability, then set the target and then measure yourself. Okay? If it's 100% deployment, we can start today. We're at 0.92. It doesn't have to be some global measure. That's our measure, 100% deployment. And then we measure ourselves every 6 months. Where do we stand today? Where do we stand today? Just like they've done in Kentucky and they're doing in other states. Okay? But I got news for you. They got stuck at 96 in Kentucky. And they're trying to figure out how to solve that problem. And we're going to have the same problem. $7 billion isn't near enough to get 100% ubiquity. So maybe the object is to say, well, we want 95% availability within 3 years. Okay? Set the target and then measure your success. We can set targets like we want 80% of households to have broadband adoption in 3 years, 5 years, whatever. And then measure where you are. Stop using normalization schemes like population or households. I mean, households is useful in some cases, but the problem with households with the OECD data is it includes business lines. So again, the thing is not bounded properly. Okay, and the way countries count business lines differs. So that's another problem. But if household adoption is your interest, then measure household adoption. Set yourself a target, not 100%, because that's unreasonable. Okay, and if you're going to set an adoption target for Mexico, make it less than it is here, or Luxembourg. You know, with all 200,000 people. Set it differently than in South Korea, where they all live in one building, and they consume a lot of that material. That's important to them. It's not so important to other cultures. We have to make the adjustments, okay? And I guess it was a lot and poorly presented, and I apologize for that. But the takeaway is establish a target, okay? And build those targets based on an economically meaningful analysis. And that means you got to include value. Let's have reasonable expectations of willingness to pay. It's about $300 a year on average. Okay? So that means you don't spend $50,000 to connect somebody because you're never going to get your money back. Okay? Even in a social welfare sense, unless you make unreasonable assumptions about the social premium. And there are limits to that value. But if you set it up and say, okay, it's $300 a year, I can get the net present value, there's some marginal cost, I can take that out, and I can start asking myself a question about should I deploy that circuit? And this is what the NTIA and the RUS are going to have to do. Okay? And they're already talking about doing this kind of thing. They're going to have to make a decision of spending $1 million here or $1 million there. What if they come in and a guy says, I'll wire Smallville fiber optics $10 million. And the other guy comes in and says, I'll wire Smallville for $2 million using 3G. Which do you choose? How do you make that decision? Okay. And in the end, you're going to have to make that decision in a value-based. What's the value of the fixed? Is the value of the fixed over the mobile worth $8 million? Right? These are valuations. Okay. And the other thing I think is going to be very helpful if you do set this up this way is you'll have to ask yourself, how big is E? How big is the social premium that everybody's talking about? How big does it have to be to justify a policy? And I think what you're going to find out is it's going to have to be enormous to justify what people are saying, and really unreasonably large. It can't be bigger than GDP, you know, something like that, which I imagine is going to get pretty close to justify some of the proposals that people have. Okay, so we have to think about the targets. Okay, let's set reasonable targets when we decide to measure broadband, and stop using things like per capita measures to compare countries. And they're going to continue to do it, I think, and it's a big mistake. It's misleading. So don't get trapped in that, and encourage better metrics through the use of a BIA-style performance index, which is actual achievement over target achievement. There may be questions. I don't know if anybody's still awake. If you do have any questions, ask now. We will have some people come up and present some discussion later. I hope better than mine. James.
Jim McConaughey, MCIA. You're up to your old church store at Constructions, which is good time. It's curious, in calculating your social costs, what externalities are you figuring play on, and how do you get the data? How hard is that?
Well, there's a number of ways to do it. I intentionally avoided the discussion for a number of reasons. I mean, you can think of what happens, okay? You think of the government. The government deploys broadband, and now people can get their tags renewed online in 2 minutes versus spending half a day at the office or whatever it is, right? That's a benefit. There are some benefits, no doubt, from health care. Okay, the availability of health care to people who may not have to travel as far as they used to. And these things can be viewed as premium. They're not sort of captured in the demand curves necessarily. Okay, but that's what you're sort of looking for, is things that don't necessarily get captured in the demand curves. I think that the idea of the premium is grossly exaggerated in standard debate. Okay, I think there is a limit. Broadband, in essence, is a transactions cost reducing technology. Okay, it is a communications technology. Okay, but it reduces transactions cost. It allows me to buy things and sell things easier. It allows me to get information easier and those sorts of things. But there's a limit to its value, and you can bound it to some extent. Another way you can do it is say, my goal is 100% broadband availability or something like that. You compute the cost of 100% broadband availability. You take willingness to pay, say, from the study we saw yesterday from Compass, and you say it's $300 a year is the willingness to pay on average or whatever. And then you say, what would it take? How big would the social premium have to be to get us to 100%? And you sort of get a scale. How far do I have to shift the demand curve out to get to 100% employment? And I think what you'll find is the number's very large, unreasonably large. Okay, there is an economic growth, component to it as well. It's not really considered an externality in the formal sense, but some people would view that as a premium. This will increase economic activity, and people don't incorporate that into their demand curves necessarily, though I don't know why. But there could be some effect like that, and we can get those through econometric estimations and things like that. Really, the point, I think, is to focus on how big does that thing have to be to justify what you're doing, and is it reasonable? But I think that you could probably assume that, and I'm going to use this approach to try to quantify it, since it's a transactions cost reduction, in the mathematics of the issue, a transactions cost reduction is the same as a tax reduction. So you could say, you could bound the value of broadband economically by saying, what would a 10% tax reduction be worth? And sort of try to scale it out that way in terms of its social value. But there are a number of ways to do it. We don't deal with it a lot here, because it's more of a conceptual idea, and people are going to have different views. Okay, but and I think there's some other interesting research. For example, the externality effect, in my view, declines significantly with speed. Okay, the faster the connection, the lower the premium, social premium. Okay, because really the social premium comes from communications. And if you view broadband as being a mixture of an investment good and a consumption good, okay, investment causes economic growth, consumption doesn't. Okay, so you treat it that way, and you say, well, for the first megabit, where I can engage in transactions, I can get information, I can send information about my heart rate to the hospital. You can see a lot of potential for premium there. But 100 channels of HD television over your broadband connection is pure consumption. The benefit from that is purely private. And it's shocking to me how people use that service as a justification for government support of broadband, basically cable television. That's not what this is about. I mean, I think that the NTIA and the RUS and the FCC should say, after about 1 megabit, the social premiums are fairly trivial. I mean, not for a hospital, of course, but that's an entirely different gig. I mean, you got to treat the hospitals differently, and that's another point I think that's interesting about the BAI is you don't have some global metric. How many of your hospitals are connected, and how? How many of your governments are connected, and how? Each piece is a metric, is a piece of the puzzle that is then scaled, And I think most countries will end up doing that kind of thing, so you can actually compare them in a meaningful way rather than a non-meaningful way.
You showed the breakdown of the coefficients to explain 90% of the way that it shifts from going into different economies.
Yeah.
Do you think the data is out there for doing that, for shifting the modalities to different countries? Give an example of Africa. Data out there, and then can you overcome some of the uncertainties you mentioned?
Yeah. That's a good question, and these are the problems that are going to have to be solved in implementation. The Anacom had collected a nice data set on consumption of different modalities, Okay, with this sort of in mind. Now, it turned out that there were a few pieces missing. And I was reluctant to estimate something that really wasn't right, even as an example, because people tend to run off of things that they shouldn't. But I think in the end we will. But you got to ask people, what are they consuming and what are they paying? Is basically what you need to know. And then what does it cost to provide service? So you could estimate, say, for a country, its demand for mobile and its demand for fixed. And then go to each state or each part of state and say, here's what it costs to do the two. I know that CostQuest, for example, has done cost modeling like that. So you could take their cost model, which is they have a mobile broadband cost model, and they, of course, have a standard wireline cost model, which I'm sure they can get DSL cost or cable modem cost out of. And you begin to say, how do we do this? And the other thing, is maybe even like reverse auctions or competitive bidding, where you go into an area and you say, whoever gives me the best deal is the low-cost provider of this. In some cases, you're not going to get a choice. Everybody would, I presume, would want fiber optics to the home, but just not going to, as what's his name says, I want a toilet made of solid gold, but it's just not in the cards. Mm-hmm.
So what you would be able to say is how, if they have been able to achieve that goal or not, or how successful they have been.
Mm-hmm.
But then in Africa, you might have a very high cost curve, then that possible consumer service might be very small.
Right.
So will there be a case that you would be able to say that Africa has been very successful, even though they might be only trying to cover a very small portion of the population, while other countries might have a bigger goal, and then they are not as successful?
Well, I think there's sort of it's a good question, and I think the answer is yes. The presumption would be that the goals would be set appropriately. Okay, now you could say a country says, "Oh yeah, we want 10 broadband connections. Look at us, we're done." You might get that, but I think what happens in the end is just like in the case of Portugal. We know what their goals are, and we can say, "Well, that's not enough." Okay, but that's and we can look at Africa and say, "Okay, well, 5% adoption is not enough. That's a pretty low goal." So you can actually evaluate people on their targets as well as the adoption. But in the end, you do need a target because Africa, we cannot compare African countries to Sweden and get any meaningful information from it. It's not even in the same. And then they could have the best policies in the world, and we'd criticize them because they don't have as much adoption. But they face an entirely different set of constraints, and that has to be accounted for in one way or the other. Okay, and whether you do it by the way I'm saying it or not, it needs to be. It's an issue that needs to be addressed and can be addressed econometrically. We've done a lot of that already. The multiple modality issue is a little more complex than we've dealt with in the past. Somebody over here? Yes, sir.
Yes, George, Scott Cleland, first year in that competition. Very, very good work. The question I had is, you may have heard that the FCC has asked the Harvard Berkman to look at the data and to look at, I imagine, the thinking you've done. I have two questions. Do you expect to be consulted in helping Berkman with that? And second of all, do you have any advice for the Berkman people that are pulling together the data out there and the analysis that you're summarizing here?
Yeah, that's a good question, Scott. I have not been asked yet. Will they? I don't know. I've got friends and enemies everywhere, and sometimes having frameworks and things is not the FCC's best option. But I don't know. If they ask, I'd certainly do it. That's what I'm in the business of doing, is trying to help make good policy. As for what they do, I don't know exactly what their charter is. I did see the news story, but it's not clear to me exactly what they're up to. But what would I mean, if somebody were to say, I want you to go gather everything that's been gathered, I have most of it on my computer somewhere. I've looked at a lot of the stuff. I think that what you're going to find, and you can't get away from, is this analysis, and that is that broadband is a good. Okay? It's a service. It's not a miracle. People with high income buy more of it. People with more education buy more of it. People in urban areas have more availability. This is the reality. And if we can get some reality in the debate, then I think that's a good thing. And maybe that would be the objective. The other thing is to look at the analysis and say, we believe this to be, a sound approach. To review the studies and say this looks like a reasonable way to go about this. Look at the studies on economic growth and broadband adoption. I've been doing a lot of that myself lately, and say it's just really measuring what we expect it to measure. I think that's a very important question. You have a propensity. I mean, of course, areas that are doing well economically will buy more broadband. So you have a problem of confounding. Is it broadband causing the economic activity, or is it economic activity causing the broadband? And none of the studies I've seen to date have addressed that question in a proper framework. Okay, now that's not to say they're wrong. It's just to say we need to look at that issue and say, here's to properly model this needs to be a simultaneous equations framework, or we need to look at the treatment literature with labor and medical devices and all that, and use those sorts of methodologies to try to figure it out. But I'd be interested, and I'll look more closely at what they're doing and may comment on it in the end. But I don't think that in the end that they're going to find many things different than you could get by reading one or two papers. Really, I mean, a lot of it's duplicative in the business.
I'd like to follow up on that last point. Again, my name is Kerry Hinton with the
Hi, Kerry.
Service Commission. In my opinion, there's been this kind of unholy reliance on the OECD rankings and been a real political fixation both nationally and state and local level. But the last point you were making about the correlation between rankings, again, whether you use OECD or use someone else's rankings, and social policy goals, whether that be economic development, whether it be advanced health care treatment or education levels. I haven't seen any studies, and I guess what you're confirming is there aren't studies that draw that correlation. In other words, if our countries that have increasing adoption rates of broadband also showing that they're having increased economic development or increased education levels or increased healthcare treatment at lower cost.
Yeah. Well, I think we're at a point, a bit of anecdotes at this point, and not in critical way. I think we're very early in the process. We do have such studies for telecommunications, for telephones, and some of them are done fairly well because we have 50 years of data. And there is a relationship. Okay, I mean, if you make investments, wise investments, typically you're going to get some economic bang for it. What's interesting, though, if you look at, say, the IT literature as well, we have extensive econometric analysis of information technology. In some cases, they separate telecommunications. In some cases, they include it in there. Usually, telecommunications is found to have a different effect than computers and software. Okay, and I think broadband is really more like communications in its role in the economy, and an interesting combination of the two. So it's going to pose some interesting modeling issues going forward. I think that in the end we will be able to do those kinds of things. I don't think that broadband connections per capita is going to be correlated with it unless you have enough in the model to solve the problem of that being misspecified. Okay, like household size and business size and things like that correct for that. And I really think, and I wonder in the literature, if you went back and looked at the studies where they divide telephones by population as a measure of telephone infrastructure if in fact what you've got is a specification error in those models and the results are all bogus. I've tinkered with that a little bit in simulations, and you can get some pretty kooky results depending on how bad the thing is. I mean, because it could be correlated with it, but you do get outliers. Okay, and you could have an outlier. I mean, if you just specified a growth model, as a growth is a function of broadband consumption. Okay, but every country has a different, household size and a different business mix or whatever. Okay, but we know that the growth is caused by it. We define it to be in simulation, and then you run a regression on it with these per capita things. I mean, you can get some sort of rough results, but you get a lot of mistakes. Okay, where you could say that, the U.S. is not poised for economic growth relative to Sweden, where really the connection base that drives the growth is the same. It's just this per capita thing has messed you up. So it's an interesting, and I know that's probably more response than you were looking for, but I think it's a very important issue in economics generally. Now that I've looked at this per capita thing, I think that's been a gross misspecification in a lot of different places. And we need to figure out whether it's not. But I just don't think it should be used at all in the broadband space. And I think you're right. There is a strong focus on the OECD rankings, but merely because it gets people as a talking point. I mean, I don't know if it's worth. But that talking point's going to sneak up on them eventually because we're not going to change. I don't think. I mean, maybe 11th would be roughly as high. I mean, in my own analysis, I think we might could get to 11th. But that's based on history, not what we're doing today. That's just the historical trend in subscription rates. And you got Australia. They're doing stuff. I mean, it's not like if we do it, we're going to jump ahead of everybody because everybody else is doing it too. So we'll probably stay approximately where we are, and I don't think that's a problem at all. I mean, we had ubiquity with telephones, and we were 16th. Who cares? Who cares? Yes. I mean,
if the problem is a mismatch between what you're counting and what you're normalizing for, why is the solution to change what you're normalizing for and what you're counting? Why not count, do surveys and say, do you have access to a broadband connection?
yeah, some people do that. Yeah, that's fine. I mean, you could take this analysis and condense it into a household penetration rate. Okay? This doesn't prohibit you from doing that. The only thing I would say is you're making a very specific assumption, and that is over time that the new households.
Not a individual access to what percentage of the population or your adult population
You could do that.
has access, whether it's in the household or
Yeah, yeah.
computing center.
If you wanted to say as an index is what percentage of the population has access, so you'd call up and you send a note to somebody and say, do you have access and how many people are in your home, for example. And it could be you got 10 people in your house. It's 10 people that have access. Okay, you could do that and convert it into a population number.
I don't see why you would even assume that if I have access to a computer, that everyone in my household has access to a computer. It's not the case.
Well, because then you have to ask, why wouldn't you? Well, I guess I'd say, why wouldn't you use the information if you could get it? Yeah. Yeah. Or you could ask how many people use your computer. Yeah. Yeah. Sure. Yeah. I mean, you could. Yeah. I mean, if that's what you want to do, that's fine. Because what you're saying, all you're saying is that I'm interested in the population as the target. So I want a number that measures population access. Okay. Now the issue would be, is it 100% of the population? Is that your target? Now, I would say that is not valid, particularly if you're going to compare Mexico to the United States. You'd have to make some adjustment in terms of if your goal is to look at policy. Okay, we're only 93% of these differences are explained. Okay, we're only talking about policy, impacting 2% of this or something. It's very small because there's going to be random variation in the data anyway. But so it's a very trivial piece. But if your goal is to measure policy, the impact of policy, then you have to set the measure up so that it measures the success of your policy. Okay, and in Portugal, it was I want 300,000 laptops out to elementary school children, Is the policy successful? Well, let's go count how many we got out. Okay, and we can say, well, that was a stupid idea. Some people may, oh, that was stupid. Why did you do that? Okay, but that's, that was their choice. They can explain why they did it that way. But that's how you measure the success. If the goal of the stimulus is 100% availability, then set that target, and let's measure that. Why are we looking at per capita normalizations when we know what it is that we want? And that's what we lack. There's nothing like what I just showed you for Portugal and the United States. There's nothing. And maybe that's what the National Broadband Plan is. We want this outcome and that outcome. We want every hospital to be connected and have a T1 access or whatever it might be. But set the goal and then measure success and quit worrying about what's going on in Sweden. Now, you can look over there and say, well, those guys have done this, that, or the other, or this is an interesting rule about, or look at Portugal and say, this idea of one computer for 5 students, that's a pretty good idea. We'll adopt that. We don't have that or whatever. I mean, that's okay. But if you're going to measure success of policy, what is the goal of the policy? And did you achieve it? Those are the only 2 questions you have to ask. We do not do that today. We do nothing like that today. And the OECD numbers will never be able to do that. So why don't we look at them? They don't answer the question that's on the table, in my opinion. Rich.
Rich Clark, AT&T. I guess I have some questions more about the heterogeneity issue.
Mm-hmm.
Often we just look at the OECD, which is the unit, just looks at penetration. It's the prime statistic they have. They'd love to have some other statistics like the speed of connections and things like that. And very interestingly, everybody points to the penetration index, which the U.S. looks so great. Everybody thinks Japan is great because Japan has such high speed service, but Japan's penetration is no higher than the U.S.
Mm-hmm.
It's really about a point or 2 lower. And Iceland, which always shows up very high in the penetration rankings, tends to have one of the lowest speed type connections. So you've got the problem with broadband is a heterogeneous service. It's not just you have it or you don't.
Yeah.
And I'm just wondering, in your analysis, you kind of finesse that issue by saying, oh, we'll just figure out what the willingness to pay. It's what the value of broadband is with the idea that everything's economic man. Converts all the multiplicity of characteristics about broadband into a single index.
Yeah.
But how feasible really is that? I guess I haven't looked at the Compass study on willingness to pay, but you calculate, let's say, an average willingness to pay, but then the question is, what there's all these different broadband offers that are out there, are those available to everybody?
Yeah, that's a great question, Rich. I really appreciate you bringing that up because I didn't mean to talk about that. You cannot deal with that issue, right, with account methodology. You can clearly deal with that in a value methodology. You would argue, say, for example, that a fiber circuit is worth X amount more than a 5 megabit circuit or whatever. 100 megabits is worth so much more than 50, is worth so much more than 5. Okay, so you actually can incorporate this value concept into the analysis because look, if we took everybody in the United States and snapped our finger or wiggled our nose and gave everybody fiber to the home right now, what would we rank? 15th. We wouldn't change, okay? Which is nuts. Okay. Now, in this approach, it would change because there is a value to that. What is the value to that? Well, we got a little bit from the Compass study, a little analysis. Well, how much extra would you pay for 50? How much extra would you pay for 100? Okay. We can actually get that data probably from surveys and things of that nature, or from the companies who have records of what the penetration into higher tiers is, how many people are willing to pay $10 for an extra 5 megabits. I think we'd be shocked at how low that is. Which is, people argue we need more speed, we need more speed, we need more speed, and then and I haven't seen any of this data, I'm guessing, but based on my own behavior and my friends' behavior, people wouldn't pay $10 for 5 megabits extra. Very few people, I think, do that. Okay. So why in the world am I going to spend a fortune to give you 100? Okay. Now Verizon is a little different. They're thinking, I think, longer run. We got to do this at some point. Why not start now? And, of course, there was the whole unbundling issue, which I think encouraged them to invest themselves out of regulation, which is fine. But that is an issue, and there's no way that the OECD methodology can deal with that. You have to have a value methodology, and I think we can estimate what the average valuation of the higher speed is. I think it's going to be very low, and I think subscription is almost the subscription rate itself is almost indifferent to speed. I don't think there's anybody out there going, I'm not going to get broadband until I get 50 megabits. I think if they can get one versus dial-up, they'll take it. So I just don't, the whole speed argument is not going to change. Our OECD rank is not going to change the adoption rate. I don't think at all. In the end, it'd be so trivial. There's nobody waiting for faster speeds. I love speed so much, I'm not going to buy it until it's really fast. That's just crazy. It's just a kooky idea. One of the many kooky ideas that dominate policy today. Well, Larry, where are we on time?
I think we're about ready to take a break if you're done.
Are there any other questions? Again, I apologize. I'm not feeling very well today. But it's all in the paper. If you have any questions, please call. I'm happy or email. I'll be happy to respond to any of your questions. And read it and don't get too active, but just kind of stew on it for a while. That's what I had to do. And the more, I mean, to some extent, I felt disappointed a little bit that it was so complicated in the end. But then I got to talking to some people about how the NTIA money is going to get spent, and I just keep coming back to this issue of what is your goal and how do we measure success. These are important issues, okay? And this analysis, whether they like it or not, is going to be embedded in their calculations about who to give money to, because you give money to the guy that gives you the most value. I mean, it's just that simple. I appreciate your time. We'll have some comments. Please stick around. We have some excellent people to talk about the paper or whatever they want to, or criticize the paper. I've given no direction on that in that regard. So get something to drink, and we'll see you in 10 minutes. Great. Thank you.